What was the question?
Do you have nuclear weapons?
I'm sorry, I can't hear.
Are you developing nuclear weapons?
I come before you today to tell you that the world shall kneel before our great nation. We are 2 months away from enriching.
Supreme Leader,
Nadal.
we are just months away from refining weapons-grade uranium, and we are set to test the missile next week. It is Israel.
Looks like we need to find a new double. Because this one is... You know, you think this man looks like me?
You have a very big barn. You must have many heavy goods.
What the fuck does that even mean?
Okay, let's rehearse this. Role play. You, come on, it's will be fun. So, Secretary General, your soldiers will win what... I'm so sorry.
You know what? I like this guy. Despite his liberal views. Very good, sir.
Supreme Leader, the suite has been renovated.
Are you serious? Where did you get those relics from? The shop?
Welcome back to the Film Box. If you are here for the first time, pull up a chair because this channel is not about summaries. This is about going inside a film and not coming out the same way you went in. Every film we cover here gets opened all the way, every layer peeled back, every hidden detail brought into the light, and today We are cracking open something that looks like a comedy on the outside but hides something much stranger and more complicated underneath. I have been sitting with this one for a while now, turning it over in my hands, trying to figure out exactly what it wants to be. And honestly, it took me more than one watch to land on how I really felt about it. That is the kind of film this is. So get comfortable. Let us open this box together. Here is what catches most people off guard about this film. It was made by the same team responsible for two of the most genuinely subversive, boundary dissolving, uncomfortable in the best way pieces of filmmaking of the early 2000s. And when it came out, a lot of people expected something in that same vein. Raw, improvised, real people caught in impossible situations, the whole world as a stage. Instead, what they got was something scripted, something structured, something that played by almost entirely different rules. And that gap between expectation and reality is where almost all the conversation about this film has lived ever since. Because the question was never really whether it was funny. The question was whether it was brave, and the answer to that is far more complicated than the marketing ever let on. Now, before we get into the story itself, let us go behind the lens for a moment. Because here at the Film Box, we believe you should understand how the box was built before you open it, and this particular box has a fascinating construction history. The first thing worth knowing is that Sacha Baron Cohen reportedly came to this project with a very specific creative frustration: the mockumentary format, the hidden camera approach that had defined his work with Ali T, Borat, and Bruno, was becoming increasingly difficult to execute. Word had spread. People recognized him. The element of authentic surprise that powered those earlier projects was harder and harder to manufacture in a world where almost everyone had a smartphone and a social media account. So the pivot to a scripted narrative was not simply a creative choice. According to various interviews from that period, it was in many ways a practical one. The world had caught up to the format, and so the format had to change. When you watch the film knowing that, you start to see it differently, not as a step backward but as an artist trying to find a new door into the same room. The second production detail worth noting is the character himself, Admiral General Aladeen. The fictional dictator of the fictional North African nation of Wadia was reportedly developed with a very deliberate composite approach. Baron Cohen and director Larry Charles studied various real-world authoritarian figures extensively, pulling specific behavior quirks, vanity habits, and rhetorical patterns from multiple sources rather than building a direct parody of any single individual. The result, according to behind the scenes accounts, was a character designed to be both ridiculous and somehow recognizable, a funhouse mirror version of a certain kind of political ego that exists across cultures and across centuries. That design intention matters enormously when you get to certain scenes that feel surprisingly pointed for what is being sold as a broad mainstream comedy. The third fact that changes how you watch certain scenes involves the New York City filming. Production reportedly faced significant real-world complications in staging certain public sequences, because, somewhat ironically, the character of Aladeen provoked genuine political reactions from real people in real public spaces. Some of the footage that ended up in the final cut reportedly incorporates authentic bystander responses to what they were watching unfold in front of them. People who did not know a film was being made, reacting to a man in full dictator regalia moving through their city. The line between scripted comedy and accidental documentary blurs in those moments in a way that quietly echoes the earlier work and gives certain street-level scenes a texture that feels slightly different from the rest of the film. The fourth detail connects directly to the casting of Anna Faris opposite Baron Cohen. Reportedly, the character of Zoe, the idealistic, fiercely principled Brooklyn health food shop owner who becomes the film's moral anchor, was specifically written to function as a genuine counterweight rather than simply a romantic prop. According to production notes from that era, the creative team wanted someone in the film who could hold her own against Baron Cohen's overwhelming comedic energy without being swallowed by it. Faris, known for her own sharp comic timing, was chosen with that specific dynamic in mind. Whether the film ultimately lives on that intention is something we will get into, but understanding the intention changes how you read every scene the two of them share. And the fifth theme, perhaps the most quietly significant, is the dedication that opens the film. The Dictator is dedicated to the late Kim Jong-il. It is played as a joke, but underneath the joke is a pointed editorial act. This is a film that wants you to laugh at authoritarianism while also making you think about it. That dual intention runs through every frame of what follows, and it is the tension between those two goals, the desire to entertain and the desire to say something real, that ultimately defines both the film's best moments and its most significant stumbles. Now, let us open the box properly. The Dictator was released in May of 2012. It was directed by Larry Charles, who had previously helmed both Borat and Bruno, and written by Sacha Baron Cohen alongside Alec Berg, David Mundell, and Jeff Schaffer, a writing team with deep roots in prestige television comedy. The cast beyond Baron Cohen and Faris includes Ben Kingsley as Tamir, the plotting uncle orchestrating events from the shadows, and John C. Reilly in a memorably absurd early cameo. The film is rated R, runs approximately 83 minutes, and sits in the genre of political satire comedy, though, as we will discuss, it is a film that sits somewhat uneasily in any single genre box. At its heart, this is a fish out of water story about power. Specifically, what happens when a man who has never faced a single consequence in his entire life is suddenly stripped of everything: his title, his identity, his authority, and forced to exist as an ordinary person in the most aggressively ordinary setting imaginable: New York City. A Brooklyn cop, a world that does not care who he used to be. The story was partly inspired by a novel, reportedly a satirical work about a fictional Arab dictator, but the film takes that seed and plants it in very specific contemporary soil. This is a post-9/11, post-Arab Spring story wearing a comedy costume, and that costume fits loosely in places, which is both its greatest strength and its most honest flaw. Should you watch it? Here is the spoiler-free version of my verdict. If you are a fan of sharp political satire with real teeth, the kind of comedy that makes you laugh and then immediately makes you uncomfortable about having laughed, this film will give you some of what you want. Not all of it, but some. If you are coming purely for the shock and chaos energy of the earlier Baron Cohen work, you will likely find it tamer, more controlled, and in places more conventional than you hoped. And if you are simply looking for a well-constructed mainstream comedy with a strong romantic arc, well, this is not quite that either. What The Dictator is a film caught between three different versions of itself, and watching it means watching all three versions fight for screen time across 83 minutes. That is not always comfortable, but it is almost always interesting. My first encounter with this film was not in a cinema. I into it a few years after release with a vague awareness of the mixed reaction it had received and a curiosity about whether that reaction was fair. And I will be honest with you, the opening sequence caught me more off guard than I expected. There is a title card, there is a dedication, and then there is a montage of imagery that is genuinely strange in its tonal ambition. It is not the opening of a comedy. Or rather, it is the opening of a comedy that wants you to know it is aware of everything it is satirizing. The production design is lavish and deliberately garish. The score swells with mock epic grandeur, and in the center of all of it is this character, this absolute monument to ego and entitlement, being presented with a kind of satirical sincerity that almost resembles admiration before it reveals itself as demolition. I walked into this film expecting a rowdy, chaotic, anything-goes comedy built on the same live-wire energy as Borat. What the film gave me instead was something more structured, more cinematic in the traditional sense, and in many moments more genuinely funny in a classical comedic construction way. The setup and payoff architecture is tight in the first act. The fish-out-of-water mechanics land well when the film trusts them. And Sacha Baron Cohen, freed from the constraints of hidden camera improvisation, does something in the early scenes that genuinely surprised me. He plays vulnerability. Not broadly, not for cheap sympathy, but there are flickers, especially in the quieter moments of the first act, where you sense something underneath the performance that is doing real character work. That caught my attention immediately. It made me lean forward. What hooked me in those first 10 minutes was the sheer confidence of the world building. This is a film that commits to its fictional geography with an almost absurd level of detail. The Republic of Wadia, its culture, its iconography, its particular flavor of state sanctioned narcissism feels developed, lived in, not just a backdrop but an actual place with its own internal logic. And then, the moment that logic collides with the real world, the film finds its fundamental comic engine. A man whose entire reality has been custom built around his own supremacy suddenly dropped into a world where nobody has received that memo. That is a classically powerful comedic premise. And for a good stretch of this film, it works beautifully. And that is where we are stepping fully inside the story now. Because what happens next? What this film does with that premise is where things get genuinely fascinating and genuinely complicated. So here is where we are. Aladdin is established. Wadia is established. And the film has done something genuinely clever in those opening sequences. It has made you laugh at this man while simultaneously giving you just enough texture to make you curious about him. That is a delicate balance to strike in the opening act of a satire. Too much sympathy and the whole satirical project collapses. Too little and there is nothing to follow emotionally for the next 80 minutes. The Dictator walks that line with more precision than it is usually given credit for. And it is worth slowing down here, really slowing down, and walking through what this film actually does with its story. Because the plot mechanics are tighter than most people remember, and the character art buried inside the comedy is more genuinely developed than the film's reputation suggests. The film opens deep in the Republic of Wadia, and what we are given immediately is a portrait of absolute power in its most adolescent, most petulant, most revealing form. Aladdin does not rule through fear alone, though fear is certainly present. He rules through an almost childlike insistence on total centrality. He is the reference point for everything. Streets are named after him. Olympic records are adjusted to ensure he holds them. His face appears on currency, on billboards, on the faces of the people paid to agree with everything he says. What the film is establishing in these early scenes is not simply that this man is a tyrant, it is that this man has been so completely surrounded by manufactured reality that he has lost any meaningful connection to actual reality. He does not know what is real because nothing in his world has ever been allowed to be real. Every person around him is a performance. Every outcome is pre-decided. Every mirror has been angled to show him only what he wants to see. This is the psychological foundation the film builds before the plot machinery kicks in, and it matters enormously. Because the comedy that follows only works if you understand what is being stripped away from this man when his identity is taken. It is not just power. It is the entire constructed universe that power created around him. When Aladdin loses his title, his beard, his recognition, he does not just lose authority, he loses his reality. And watching a man who has never encountered actual reality suddenly forced to live inside it, that is where the film finds its truest comedic and emotional territory. The inciting event arrives when Aladdin is summoned to New York City to address the United Nations regarding Wadia's nuclear program. This is a genuine geopolitical pressure point, the kind of real-world context the film uses consistently to remind you that underneath the absurdity, there is something it actually wants to say about how power functions in the real world. Aladdin arrives with his full entourage, his full entitlement, and his full conviction that the world will rearrange itself around his presence. New York, predictably, does not receive this memo. What happens next is where the plot takes its central turn. His uncle Tamer, played with beautifully restrained menace by Ben Kingsley, has been quietly orchestrating a conspiracy. Tamer wants to open Wadia to foreign corporations and foreign investment. He wants democracy, not out of any principled belief in it, but because democracy, in his reading, is simply a more efficient mechanism for transferring national wealth into private hands. And Aladdin, with his iron grip on the country, stands in the way of that. So Tamer has arranged for Aladdin to be replaced, to be kidnapped, stripped of his distinctive beard, and substituted with a look-alike double named Ifawad, a man of spectacular and weaponized stupidity who can be steered towards signing whatever Tamir puts in front of him. The kidnapping sequence is worth pausing on for a moment. It is executed by a character played by John C. Reilly, a brief, absurdist, completely committed performance that functions almost like a short film within a film. Reilly plays a man hired to eliminate Aladeen, and the scene between them has a lunatic energy that feels genuinely dangerous in the comedic sense. You cannot quite predict where it is going or how far it will go. It is one of the film's purest moments of comedic abandon, and then it ends, and the real story begins. Aladeen escapes. But he escapes as a nobody. Beardless, stripped of every marker of identity, he is just a man in New York City who speaks heavily accented English, holds views that are aggressively incompatible with civilized society, and has absolutely no practical skills for navigating ordinary life. He cannot hail a cab without triggering a security response. He cannot walk through a crowd without creating chaos. He cannot interact with a single human being in a way that does not result in immediate social catastrophe. And this is where the film shifts into its middle section, and where the comedy becomes most alive and most honest. Because what the film is doing in these middle sequences is using Aladeen's complete social incompetence as a lens. Every interaction he has in New York is a collision between his internalized worldview and the actual world, and those collisions generate not just laughs but genuine satirical friction. When he encounters a woman being assertive and self-determining, his confusion is not just played for shock comedy. It is the confusion of a man who has genuinely never been in a world where women have autonomy. When he encounters poverty and inequality in New York, his immediate response is not sympathy but a kind of delighted recognition, because these conditions are familiar to him, just usually existing in a place where he is the one on top. These moments have a bite to them that the surface reading of the film tends to miss entirely. The person who pulls him in from the street, and this is where the film's emotional architecture becomes most interesting, is Zoe. Anna Faris plays her as a woman of almost aggressive idealism. She runs a feminist, worker-owned, aggressively progressive organic food collective in Brooklyn. She is everything that Aladeen's entire value system is designed to dismiss, diminish, and eventually suppress, and she gives him a job. Not out of naivety, the film is careful to give Zoe a kind of shrewd, knowing quality beneath her optimism, but out of a genuine commitment to the principle that people deserve chances. Even people who are clearly, demonstrably, perhaps dangerously wrong about almost everything. The dynamic between Aladeen and Zoe is the film's heart, and it is genuinely more complex than the standard fish out of water romantic setup would suggest. These are not two people softening each other through charm. They are two people with fundamentally incompatible worldviews being forced to occupy the same space, and what happens between them is not a simple conversion story. Aladeen does not become a good person because he falls in love. He begins slowly and incompletely to encounter the possibility that his worldview might be wrong, and that is a meaningfully different thing. The film is honest enough to keep him genuinely compromised throughout. He never fully transforms, and that is actually more truthful to how ideology and character work in real life than a clean redemption arc would have been. Meanwhile, the parallel storyline running through Tamir's machinations keeps the political satire machinery ticking. Forward, the double is being managed towards signing a democratic constitution that will, in Tamir's hands, become a mechanism for exactly the kind of corrupt resource extraction that many genuine post-colonial nations have experienced under the banner of democratic reform. And here is where the film makes its most pointed observation, and where it deserves genuine credit. The satire of the democracy narrative is not comfortable. Tamir's argument that democracy is simply the preferred branding of a certain kind of power transfer is presented with enough internal coherence that it lands as something more than a throwaway joke. It is uncomfortable precisely because there is truth in it. And mainstream Hollywood comedy having the nerve to put that idea on screen, even briefly, even in the middle of a laugh per minute structure, That is worth noticing. There is a scene in the middle section of the film, Aladeen and Zoe at a birthing class, of all places, that I want to hold up for a moment because it illustrates something the film does repeatedly and does well. The scene begins as pure fish out of water comedy. Aladeen, surrounded by expecting parents, is catastrophically out of place. His cultural references are wrong. His instincts are wrong. His fundamental relationship to the human body and its functions is filtered through a lifetime of being surrounded by yes people who have never challenged him on anything. And then the scene shifts, supply, almost imperceptibly. There is a moment, brief, quiet, almost accidental feeling, where Aladdin watches something real happen, something human. And the comedy pauses, just for a beat, and in that beat the character opens up just slightly. Just enough for you to see something underneath a performance that feels like a genuine person. And then the comedy snaps back and the scene continues. But you carry that beat with you, and those beats accumulated throughout the film are doing the actual character work that the story depends on. The film builds toward its climax through a series of escalating decisions and reversals. Aladdin working to reclaim his identity, his authority, his place, while simultaneously being changed, however partially, by everything he has encountered in his time outside the gilded cage. The question the third act sets up is deceptively simple. If you give a man back everything he had before, is he the same man who lost it? And the film's answer to that question, delivered in a speech that we will return to in full detail in the spoiler section, is one of the most genuinely surprising and genuinely daring things the film does. It comes out of nowhere. It earns its shock. And it lands with a punch that the rest of the film, in some ways, is only preparing you for. Now, let us talk about what this film does brilliantly. Because there are real things here worth naming precisely, not just generally praising, but identifying the specific moments and mechanisms that work. Start with Sacha Baron Cohen himself. This is a performance that deserves more serious attention than it typically receives. The instinct when discussing Baron Cohen is to focus on the shock comedy, the transgressive energy, the sheer audacity of the character choices, and those things are present. But what is less often discussed is the physical specificity of the performance. The way Aladdin moves, holds himself, occupies space. This is a man who has never had to accommodate another person's physical presence in his entire life, and Baron Cohen makes that legible in the body before a single word is spoken. There is a particular quality to the way Aladdin sits, sprawling, ownership claiming, genuinely incapable of considering whether his physical presence is an imposition on anyone else. It is beautifully observed, and it pays off dramatically in the scenes where Aladdin is stripped of his context, because suddenly that same body, in a world that owes it nothing, becomes comical precisely through its own unchanged insistence. The scene that proves Baron Cohen's range in this film, the scene I keep coming back to, is a quieter one than you might expect. It is a scene in Zoe's shop, late in the second act, where Aladdin is alone for a moment and something catches him off guard. I will not get into the full details before the spoiler section, but there is a moment where the mask of the character, the performed grandiosity, the cultivated contempt slips completely, and what is underneath it is something small and almost childlike, something that has never been allowed to develop because the circumstances of his life never required it to. It is a genuinely affecting moment in the middle of a broad satire, and it is entirely Baron Cohen's doing. That is the kind of acting that rarely gets acknowledged in this genre, and it should be. Anna Faris is doing something equally precise and equally undervalued on the other side of the film. Zoe could easily have been a cartoon, a walking collection of progressive signifiers designed purely to be the butt of the joke, and the script does occasionally push her in that direction. But Faris refuses to play her as a punchline. There is a genuine intelligence and warmth in the performance that anchors the emotional core of the film. When Zoe sees something in Aladdin that he cannot yet have seen himself, Faris makes that legible without making it naive. It is a difficult tonal task, and she handles it with real skill. The chemistry between Hurl and Baron Cohen is also genuinely surprising, warm and specific in a way that makes the film's romantic thread feel earned rather than obligatory. Ben Kingsley deserves his own moment here. This is an actor who has played real historical figures, who has commanded some of the most serious dramatic spaces in cinema, and here he is playing a scheming uncle in a political comedy with absolute commitment and zero condescension. That is a rare quality in a performer of his stature. Tamir could have been a broad villain, a simple obstacle. Instead, Kingsley gives him a kind of chilling pragmatic intelligence. Every scene he is in, he brings a gravity that makes the political satire feel weightier. He is the film's reminder that underneath the comedy, something real is being discussed. The direction courtesy of Larry Charles deserves credit for something that is easy to overlook: restraint. Given the material and the talent involved, the instinct could have been to push everything farther, harder, louder at every moment. Instead, Charles consistently gives the comedy room to breathe. The timing on the best jokes in this film comes from knowing when to hold, when to let the silence do the work. The scene in the helicopter above New York early in the film is a perfect example. The comedy builds not through rapid-fire cutting or escalating noise, but through a sustained, increasingly absurd situation allowed to develop at its own pace. That kind of comic patience is rarer than it looks, and it is what separates the film's best sequences from the ones that feel rushed. Visually, the contrast between Wadia and Newark is handled with more care than you might expect from a mainstream comedy. The Wadia sequences are shot with a kind of sun-baked, over-saturated grandeur, every frame trying to be a propaganda image, every composition exaggerated toward monument and spectacle. Then New York arrives and everything flattens. The pilot cools. The flame becomes more crowded, more democratic, more chaotic. That visual contrast is doing storytelling work beyond what the script requires. It is expressing in pure image what the character is experiencing. The difference between a world built to reflect your power and a world that is simply indifferent to your existence. The score by Admiral Baron Cohen, Sacha's brother, is one of the film's most underappreciated elements. It functions on two levels simultaneously. There is the mock epic register, the sweeping grandiose orchestral and Middle Eastern inflected passages that play Aladeen's worldview straight, as if accompanying a genuine hero narrative. And then there are the quieter, more grounded cues underneath the New York sequences that gradually shift the emotional register towards something more human. The music is not commenting on the action from a distance. It is doing the same thing the best elements of the script are doing, holding two tones at once and trusting the audience to feel both. The single most unforgettable scene in the film, and I want to be specific about why it works, is the speech at the United Nations in the third act. We will return to its full content in the spoiler section, but what I want to note here is its structural function. It is the moment where all of the film's competing tones and intentions finally arrive in the same place at the same time. The comedy, the satire, the genuine political commentary, and the character arc all converge in approximately 3 minutes of screen time. It is a genuinely remarkable piece of writing, and it is almost disorienting in a film that has spent much of its runtime on broader, more conventional comedy. The tonal jump is jarring, but in the best possible way. It is the film suddenly revealing what it was actually building toward all along. That landing owns the whole journey. Now, and this matters, because honesty is what the film box is built on. Let us talk about where the film falls short. Because it does fall short in specific, identifiable ways. And understanding those failures is as important as celebrating the successes. The most significant problem with The Dictator is its tonal inconsistency, and it is worth being precise about what that means. This is not simply a film that mixes broad comedy with serious satire. That is a legitimate and historically successful mode. The problem is that the film does not always seem to know which register it is operating in at any given moment. There are sequences, particularly in the middle section, where the comedy becomes genuinely scattershot, reaching for short laughs that feel disconnected from the film's larger satirical project. When the humor is rooted in the character, when it comes from Aladeen's specific ideologically compromised worldview colliding with reality, it works. When it drifts into territory that feels more like a general comedy sketch that could belong to any film, the satirical engine goes quiet, and you feel it. There is a slackening, a sense of drift. The film loses altitude in those moments and has to work to regain it. The romantic arc between Aladeen and Zoe, while better than it is usually credited with being, is also underdeveloped in the second act in a way that creates problems for the third act payoff. The film rushes through certain emotional beats that need more space to land properly. We needed one more scene, possibly two, of genuine, unguarded connection between these two characters before the story asks us to believe that their relationship has become the thing that changes him. Without that additional foundation, the emotional pivot in the third act, while effective, does not hit as hard as it should. You feel a mechanism of the plot more than the reality of the relationship. And in a film that is genuinely trying to earn its emotional moments, that gap is frustrating precisely because you can see how close it came to closing it. The double plot of Awad and Tamil managing the UN speech is also handled with less precision than it deserves. Ben Kingsley is magnificent in every scene he gets, but the film does not give him enough scenes. Tamir's conspiracy is the political backbone of the entire satirical argument, and it is treated at times as almost a supporting subplot rather than the thematic engine it needs to be. As a result, when the satirical commentary arrives at its sharpest in the third act, it sometimes feels slightly underpowered. Not because the writing is weak, but because the setup has been underweighted. The film needed to spend more time with Tamir earlier, making his argument more fully present, so that the final confrontation between his worldview and Aladeen's fractured one lands with maximum force. There are also several comedic sequences in the first half that lean on cultural contrast humor in ways that feel less precisely targeted than the film's best moments. The humor at its strongest in this film comes from a specific political and psychological place, from what Aladeen's particular worldview reveals about the nature of power itself. When the humor drifts from that specific place toward more generalized cultural caricature, it loses its analytical edge. It is still funny in some cases, but it is funny in a way that any film might be funny, and that is a lesser thing than what this film is capable of at its peak. The pacing in the second act specifically deserves mention. After the strong first act setup and before the genuinely powerful third act, there is a stretch of roughly 20 minutes where the film meanders slightly, trying out tonal registers that do not all pay off, cycling through supporting characters and set-piece sequences that are individually amusing but collectively unfocused. The film does not lose you entirely in this stretch, but it loses some of its momentum. And for a comedy that has established such a sharp premise and such specific satirical ambitions, losing momentum at the midpoint is a real cost. It is the kind of pacing problem that a tighter edit, perhaps 10 minutes shorter overall, would have addressed effectively. And finally, and this is a criticism that requires some care in the framing, the film makes choices in certain sequences that feel designed to provoke rather than to illuminate. There is a difference between satire that makes you uncomfortable because it is telling a truth you have not fully faced, and humor that makes you uncomfortable because it is simply pushing against a social norm without a clear analytical purpose. The best moments in The Dictator are firmly in the first category, but there are moments, scattered through the middle section particularly, that feel more like the second. They generate a reaction, but when you sit with the reaction, you find it is not connected to anything the film is actually saying. That gap between the provocation and the purpose is where the film's commercial instincts and its artistic ambitions occasionally work against each other. And it is why the film feels at certain moments like two different films trying to occupy the same 83 minutes. None of these criticisms destroy the film. Let me be clear about that. The Dictator is a more intelligent, more genuinely crafted piece of work than its reputation suggests, but it is also a less fully realized piece of work than its best moments promise. And sitting with that tension between what it achieves and what it almost achieves is the most honest way to describe the experience of watching it. Now let us step back from the film itself for a moment. Because no film exists in a vacuum. Every film is a product of its exact cultural moment, shaped by what the world was thinking, what it was afraid of, what it was arguing about, and what it desperately needed to laugh at. And The Dictator arrived in a moment that was, to put it plainly, extraordinarily loaded. Understanding that moment does not just give you context, it fundamentally changes how you read almost every choice the film makes. So let us build that picture carefully, because this is one of those cases where the world outside the cinema screen is almost as interesting as the world inside it. May 2012. Think about where the world was. The Arab Spring had erupted just over a year earlier, a wave of popular uprisings across North Africa and the Middle East that had toppled governments, rewritten constitutions, and forced the entire world to reckon with questions about authoritarianism, democracy, and what it actually means for ordinary people to demand agency over their own lives. Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Yemen, Bahrain, these were not abstract geopolitical events. These were real revolutions happening in real time, broadcast on social media, watched on smartphones, discussed in every corner of the world. Muammar Gaddafi had been captured and killed in October 2011, barely 7 months before The Dictator opened in cinemas. Hosni Mubarak had been removed from power and was on trial in Egypt. The entire concept of the strongman ruler, the entrenched, personality cult driven, oil backed dictator, was under active, violent, genuine challenge across an entire region. Into that specific cultural moment, Sacha Baron Cohen and Larry Charles released a broad comedy about a fictional North African dictator. Think about the nerve that required, and think about the tightrope it demanded. This was not historical satire, safe in the distance of time, like a film about a long-dead tyrant. This was satire in real time. The things being parodied were actively happening. The regimes being mocked had real counterparts that real people were risking their lives to dismantle at that very moment. And the film had to navigate that reality. To be funny without being trivializing, to be pointed without being exploitative, to mock the powerful without inadvertently mocking the people suffering under that power. The film does not entirely succeed at that navigation, but it is important to acknowledge that it tried and that the attempt itself was notable. In 2012, most major studio comedies were not engaging with the Arab Spring at all. They were not touching the question of authoritarianism, the mechanics of dictatorship, or the relationship between Western corporate interests and autocratic governments in the developing world. The Dictator rose, imperfectly, unevenly, with commercial concessions that blunted some of its sharpest edges. But it was engaging, and in the cultural landscape of mainstream Hollywood comedy in 2012, that engagement was genuinely unusual. There was also a specific cinematic context into which this film arrived. 2012 was a moment when the political comedy and satire space was in an interesting state of transition. Television had become the dominant home for sharp political satire. The Daily Show, The Colbert Report, and their descendants had essentially colonized the territory of pointed political comedy and done so with a sophistication and consistency that cinema was struggling to match. The big studio political comedy was in something of an identity crisis, trying to be edgy enough to feel relevant while remaining commercial enough to justify the budgets involved. The Dictator was navigating that tension with every creative choice it made. Every time it chose a broader joke over a sharper one, you could feel the commercial consideration at work. Every time it landed a genuinely pointed satirical observation, you could feel what the film might have been if those commercial constraints had been loosened a little further. The critical reception when the film opened was, to put it diplomatically, divided. Not in the clean way where some critics loved it and others hated it, but in the more complicated way where almost every critic seemed to be responding to a slightly different film. Some reviewers praised it as a surprisingly layered political satire wearing a comedy costume, noting specifically the third act speech and the Tamia subplot as evidence of genuine artistic ambition. Others dismissed it as a significant step backward from the dangerous, authentic energy of the earlier Baron Cohen work, arguing that the shift to scripted narrative had domesticated the comedy and removed precisely what made it worth watching. and the third group occupied an uncomfortable middle ground, acknowledging the film's genuine moments of inspiration while being honest about the unevenness of the overall experience. What is interesting looking back at those reviews now is how much the critical response reflected the reviewers' relationship to the earlier Baron Cohen work. Critics who had championed Borat as a masterpiece of cultural critique tended to be the most disappointed by The Dictator because they were measuring it against a very specific and very high benchmark. Critics who came to the film more neutrally, without that specific frame of comparison, tended to find more to appreciate. And that tells you something important about reception as a phenomenon. Sometimes the most formidable obstacle a film can face is the shadow of its creator's own previous work. The audience response was considerably warmer than the critical consensus. The film opened to solid box office numbers, reportedly earning around $17 million in its opening weekend in North America alone, against a production budget that was by Hollywood standards relatively modest. Audiences, by and large, were laughing. They were quoting lines, they were recommending it to their friends. The disconnect between the critical caution and the audience enthusiasm is itself a fascinating document of the film's dual nature. The critics were responding to what the film was trying to be, and the audiences were responding to what the film actually was in the moment of watching it. Both responses were legitimate, both were incomplete. The awards conversation around The Dictator was predictably thin. This was not the kind of film that enters award season conversations. Not because it is without merit, but because the Academy and its equivalents have historically struggled to know what to do with broad political comedy, particularly comedy of this transgressive flavor. There was some recognition in the comedy-specific award spaces. Baron Cohen's performance received attention in certain circles for exactly the reasons we have already discussed. But the film was not a major awards presence. That is arguably a failure of institutional imagination rather than a judgment on the film's actual quality. The third act speech alone, as a piece of writing, deserves recognition that it largely did not receive. And Baron Cohen's physical and emotional specificity in the lead role is more accomplished than the awards landscape was willing to acknowledge. What is more interesting than the initial awards conversation is the film's streaming life and its second wave discovery. Because The Dictator is one of those films that has grown in cultural resonance since its release rather than diminishing. When it became available on streaming platforms and reached audiences who were not necessarily primed by the 2012 cultural context, younger viewers coming to it fresh, international audiences encountering it outside the specific noise of its release moment, the response was frequently one of genuine surprise. Not just at the comedy, which holds up well, but at the satirical content. At the third act speech specifically, at the Tamisa plot and its uncomfortable implications about democracy as a tool of corporate extraction. In a post-2016 world, a world that had watched the re-emergence of personality cult politics in multiple Western democracies, that had watched the language of autocracy creep back into mainstream political discourse in places where it had seemed safely buried, the film's satirical targets started looking rather different than they had in 2012. The joke about the leader who controls all media, suppresses opposition, and insists on total personal loyalty stopped feeling like a comfortable parody of something safely foreign and distant. The observation that democracy can be a brand rather than a value, that the language of popular government can be used as effectively by those who want to dismantle it as by those who want to protect it, started landing with a sharpness that perhaps the original 2012 audience did not fully feel. The film found a second life in that new context, and the discovery of that second life is ongoing. Does The Dictator feel timeless, or does it feel perfectly of its era? Honestly, both, in different measures. The broad comedy, the fish out of water mechanics, the romantic arc, these are timeless structural elements that will work as long as human beings respond to the comedy of collision between incompatible worldviews. But the specific satirical targets, the Arab Spring subtext, the particular flavor of post 9/11 anxiety about the Islamic world that runs through certain sequences, these are precisely dated to that cultural moment in a way that is both a strength and a limitation. The strength is that the film has a specific historical texture, that makes it a genuine document of its time, something you can watch in 20 years and understand something true about the early 2010s from. The limitation is that some of that specific texture can date certain sequences in ways that occasionally make them feel more like artifacts than active comedy. The film is most alive when it is making observations that transcend their moment. It is most clearly of its moment when it reaches for the easy cultural contrast laugh rather than the harder, truer satirical insight. But now we go deeper. Because what we have been discussing so far is the film's surface layer. Its story, its craft, its cultural context, and the film box does not stop at the surface. So let us go all the way down to what this film is actually about. Not what it is about on the story level, we know that. A dictator loses power and finds his humanity, that is the surface. Let us go beneath it. At its core, stripped of the comedy, stripped of the satire, stripped of every production consideration and commercial compromise, The Dictator is a film about the relationship between identity and power. Specifically, it is asking this question: who are you when the thing that defines you is taken away? And that question is not a small one. It is one of the deepest questions human beings face, because all of us, to varying degrees, define ourselves through our roles, through what we do, what we control, what others recognize us as. We are our jobs, our titles, our reputations, our relationships. We are the way other people see us. And the terrifying thing that this film dramatizes, using the most extreme possible version of that dependency, is what happens when all of that external definition evaporates overnight. Aladeen is not simply a dictator. He is a man who has never been required to exist outside of a structure entirely built around his own centrality. From birth, and the film makes this clear. Every system around him was designed to confirm, reinforce, and magnify a sense of singular importance. He was never just a boy, he was the heir. He was the future ruler. He was the embodiment of the nation's destiny. Every relationship he has ever had has been mediated by that fact. Nobody in his life has ever interacted with him as simply a person, as a human being with flaws and limitations and needs and confusions that are just the ordinary texture of being alive. Every person around him has been either in service of the role or in fear of it, and that means that Aladeen, for all his power, has never actually been known. Not once. Not by anyone. There is something genuinely tragic in that, and the film is brave enough to let that tragedy breathe, even in the middle of its comedy. The loneliness of absolute power is not a new theme in literature or cinema, but The Dictator approaches it from a specific and relatively underexplored angle. Not the loneliness of the tyrant who knows his power is illegitimate and lives in fear of its removal, but the loneliness of the tyrant who has been so completely insulated from genuine human connection that he does not even know what he is missing. Aladeen does not feel lonely because he has never experienced the alternative. He does not know what it feels like to be in a room with someone who sees you clearly and stays anyway. And that specific form of emotional impoverishment, that gap at the center of a life defined entirely by external power, is what the film is really excavating. When that power is stripped away, something interesting happens. Aladeen does not crumble immediately. His first response is characteristic. He attempts to reassert authority through sheer force of will. He behaves as if the world around him simply has not yet been informed of his status, and that once the information gap is corrected, the proper order will be restored. This is not stupidity. It is the deeply ingrained behavioral pattern of a man for whom the assertion of authority has always worked. The idea that authority could be permanently ineffective, that there could be a world in which his particular claims on it simply do not function, is not yet available to him as a concept. And watching the film navigate that process, the slow, resistant, painful opening of a mind to a reality it was never built to accept, is genuinely interesting character work beneath the comedy. What changes him is not a single revelation. The film is honest enough to resist that kind of dramatic shortcut. what changes him or begins to change him, because the film is also honest about the incompleteness of the change, is accumulated exposure to people who have no investment in his performance. Zoe does not know who he was. The people who work in her collective do not know. The city around him does not know. And in that anonymity, something extraordinary and unexpected happens. For the first time in his life, Aladeen is forced to actually be present in interactions that have no stakes related to his power. He has to actually listen, actually respond, actually adjust his behavior based on the real reactions of real people rather than the manufactured reactions of a court assembled to please him. And that experience, the simple, radical experience of genuine human interaction, is what begins the process of change. Now, the film does not pretend that this process is clean or complete or irreversible, and that matters. Because the temptation in a story like this is to give the character a clean redemption arc, to have the moment of transformation be decisive, permanent, unambiguous. The dictator resists that temptation at almost every turn. Aladeen never fully stops being the person he was. He cannot. That person is too deeply embedded. What he gains instead is something smaller but arguably more honest. A crack, an opening, a moment of genuine doubt about the worldview he has always inhabited. And the film asks us to consider whether that crack, that first small fracture in a lifetime of ideological certainty, is itself a form of change worth acknowledging. This connects to something the film is doing thematically with the concept of authenticity. Almost every relationship in Aladdin's world in Wadia is performed. His advisors perform loyalty, his subjects perform devotion, his guards perform admiration. The entire apparatus of the state is a kind of perpetual theatrical production in which everyone has a role and everyone knows their lines, and nobody, absolutely nobody, is permitted to break character. And Aladdin himself is performing too. The role of the supreme leader is as much a performance as any of the others. It requires costume, staging, rehearsal, an audience that plays along. What happens in New York is that the performance cannot be maintained. The stage set has been removed. The audience has not received the script. And what is left when the performance cannot continue? That is the question the film is really asking. What is left is surprisingly human, surprisingly ordinary, surprisingly recognizable. And that is the film's deepest and most generous insight, that beneath the layers of power and ideology and manufactured identity, there is something in Aladdin that is simply human. Not good necessarily, not reformed necessary, but human, capable of curiosity, capable in the right conditions of something that resembles genuine connection. The film is not making an argument that all tyrants are secretly redeemable. It is too smart and too honest for that. What it is making is an argument that the machinery of authoritarianism depends on the suppression of that human core, and that the machinery, powerful as it is, cannot suppress it completely. Somewhere underneath the performance, the person is still there, changed by the performance, shaped by it, perhaps damaged by it beyond full repair, but still there. Connect that to your own life for a moment, because this is the invitation the film is extending, even if it extends it from behind a shield of extreme comedy. Think about the roles you perform, the ways in which the identity is assigned to you by your family, your career, your community, your culture, have shaped not just how others see you, but how you see yourself. Think about what it would mean to be stripped of those rules overnight, to wake up tomorrow in a world where none of your usual markers of identity were recognized, where you had to simply be a person without the supporting architecture of reputation or role or relationship. Who would you be? What would remain? The dictator is asking that question from the most extreme possible vantage point, a man for whom the external architecture is more total, more absolute, more all-encompassing than anything most of us will ever experience. But the question underneath it is the same question, and that is why the film, for all its absurdity, for all its broad comedy and deliberate provocation, touches something real, something that lingers after the laughter fades. There is also a secondary thematic layer in the film that deserves its own moment of attention, and that is the film's engagement with the idea of the West and its relationship to the developing world. This is the layer that gets least discussion in casual conversation about the film, and it is arguably the most sophisticated thing the dictator is doing through Tamiya's conspiracy. The plan to use the language of democracy to enable resource extraction, the film is making an argument about how Western institutions have historically engaged with post-colonial states. The argument is uncomfortable. It suggests that the democratic values the West exports are frequently vehicles for economic interests rather than genuine commitments to human flourishing. That the language of freedom and self-determination can be used just as effectively by those who want to dismantle freedom as by those who want to protect it. That the form of democracy, the election, the constitution, the institutional structure can be adopted as a brand without the substance. This is a genuinely bold argument to embed in a mainstream Hollywood comedy, and the film makes it clearly enough in the Tamiya scenes in the third act speech that you cannot quite dismiss it as accidental. Someone in the writing room knew what they were saying, and they said it in a context, a broad R-rated comedy aimed at a young mainstream audience, where those ideas might reach people who would better seek them out in a more explicitly political format. That is a real service imperfectly executed, but genuinely attempted, and it deserves acknowledgement. The film is also quietly engaging with a theme about the performance of masculinity under authoritarian conditions. Specifically, the way that extreme patriarchal power systems both produce and then trap the men at their center. Aladeen's relationship to women in the film is obviously played for satirical comedy. His assumptions are preposterous, his behavior is indefensible, and the film frames it as such. But underneath the comedy is something more interesting. Aladeen has never had a genuine relationship with any person in his life, and his relationship with women in particular reflects a specific kind of emotional underdevelopment that is not simply individual pathology but systemic product. He was raised in a system that denied women humanity, and in doing so, that system also denied him access to a full range of human connection. The dehumanization runs both ways. The oppressor is also impoverished by the structures of oppression, even if his impoverishment is incomparably less costly than that of those he oppresses. The film does not let Aladeen off the hook, but it is smart enough to suggest that the hook was forged in a particular cultural furnace, not simply invented by individual malice. And then there is the film's treatment of loyalty, what it looks like under authoritarian conditions versus what it looks like freely given. Nadal, the scientist character who is genuinely devoted to Aladeen and whose devotion Aladeen has spent years casually abusing and dismissing, represents something important in this thematic architecture. His loyalty is real, not manufactured by fear, but generated by something genuinely felt. And the film shows Aladeen slowly and confusedly beginning to recognize the difference between loyalty that is compelled and loyalty that is chosen. That recognition, the dawning awareness that there is a qualitative difference between the two that his entire life has trained him not to see, is one of the quieter emotional threads the film carries with genuine care. It does not shout about it, but it is there, running underneath everything, connecting back to the film's central meditation on authenticity and performance and what it actually means to be known. Alright, full spoilers from this point. If you haven't seen the film yet, close this now. Go watch it and come back when you're ready. Trust me, you'll want to experience it fresh. Still here? Good, because now we go all the way in. Let us return to the setup we have already discussed and carry it forward into its full resolution. We know that Aladeen has been stripped of his identity by Tamir's conspiracy, that if Awad the Double is being maneuvered towards signing a democratic constitution that would open Wadia's oil wealth to foreign corporate exploitation, and that Aladeen himself has been adrift in New York working in Zoe's collective, beginning reductantly, conclipedly, but genuinely to encounter the possibility of a different kind of life. The first major twist the film delivers in its third act is the reveal of what Tamir's democracy actually means, and the film is admirably clear-eyed about this. When Aladdin eventually reclaims access to Tamir's plans and understands what is happening, that the democratic transition being orchestrated is not a genuine transfer of power to the Wadian people, but a legal mechanism for dismantling state ownership of national resources and transferring them to international corporations, his reaction is not simple moral outrage. It is something more complicated and more interesting. He recognizes the mechanism. He understands how it works. Because he has seen the same mechanism from the inside, he has used power as a personal resource, extracted from the people below him, justified by a narrative of national destiny and personal exceptionalism. What Tamir is doing is the same thing, just with different branding. This moment of recognition. Aladdin, seeing in Tamir's plan the same fundamental logic that has governed his own rule, is the film's most sophisticated plot beat. It is the moment where the satire and the character arc converge most completely. Because the implication is not that Aladdin is becoming good, it is that he is becoming clear-sighted. He can see the mechanism now because he is outside the machine. And that clarity, not moral transformation but genuine insight, is what drives his decision to act. The plan to reclaim his identity and stop the constitutional signing involves Aladdin reconnecting with Nada, who has survived the initial events of the conspiracy. And the reunion between these two characters is handled with the warmth that the film earns through the accumulation of small specific details laid in throughout the story. Nada's loyalty to Aladdin is not naive. The film has shown us clearly that Aladdin has treated him badly, dismissed him repeatedly, taken his devotion entirely for granted. But Nadan's loyalty is also not conditional on Aladdin deserving it. It is simply there, freely given, freely maintained. And Aladdin's gradual uncomfortable realization that this specific quality, loyalty given freely rather than extracted by force, is something he has never allowed himself to recognize or value, is one of the film's most genuinely moving threads. The disguise sequence. Aladdin and Nadal working to get Aladdin back into a position where he can reclaim his identity and reach the UN before the constitutional signing generates some of the film's best physical comedy. But it also does something structurally important. It forces Aladdin to genuinely depend on another person for the first time in his adult life. Not to command, not to demand, to actually need help, to ask for it, to function as one half of a collaborative effort rather than as the singular authority point around whom all effort orbits. That experience is new for him. The film does not make a huge, dramatic deal out of it. It lets it land quietly, through behavior rather than declaration. But it is doing real character work. Every moment in which Aladdin has to ask rather than command, cooperate rather than dictate, adjust his behavior in response to another person's input rather than simply issuing orders. These moments are building blocks in the architecture of his change. The relationship with Zoe reaches its crisis point in the third act when she discovers who Aladdin actually is. Not just his fictional identity as a person she met on the street, but his actual identity, what he has done, what his government has done, the human cost of the system he has represented and perpetuated, and this confrontation is where Anna Faris does the best work of her performance. The scene is not played as simple betrayal or simple rage, though both are present. It is played as the collision between a genuine investment in a specific person and the knowledge of what that person has been. Zoe has seen something real in Aladdin. She knows it was real. And a question the scene poses, whether what you saw in someone is negated or complicated or simply contextualized by learning the full truths of who they are, is not a simple question. It is the question the film has been building toward all along. Aladdin's response to this confrontation is the film's emotional turning point. And here the performance is doing something that I want to be specific about. He does not defend himself. He does not reach for authority. There is no authority left to reach for. He does not perform remorse in the theatrical, exaggerated way that his character has performed everything else throughout the film. What it does is something much quieter, much more specific, and much more revealing. He simply remains present. He does not leave. He does not attack. He does not deflect. He stays in the room and absorbs the truth of what he is being told. And that stillness, from a character who has been in constant performative motion since the first frame, is itself the most eloquent thing the film could have chosen in that moment. It says, something has changed. I am not the same man who came to this city. I do not know exactly what I am, but I know I cannot be that person anymore. And then comes the speech. The scene at the United Nations where Aladeen delivers the address that will determine the future of Wadia is where the dictator plants its flag most firmly and most memorably. This is the scene that changes the conversation about this film if you let it. Here is what happens, in its full satirical glory. Aladeen takes the podium. The world is watching. Tamir is watching, believing that the constitutional signing is secured. Zoe is watching from the crowd, and instead of delivering the expected address, the one that would legitimize the democratic transition and seal the oil contracts, Aladeen begins to speak, and what he says is, on the surface, a defense of dictatorship. He outlines the features of authoritarian governance, the control of media, the suppression of opposition, the concentration of wealth in the hands of a tiny elite, the use of surveillance to monitor ordinary citizens, the imprisonment of political opponents, the prioritization of military spending over social welfare, and he presents them as virtues, as the hallmarks of a successful system. And then, and this is the turn that makes the speech genuinely remarkable, he asks the audience why they are so horrified. Because every feature he has just described, he observes, is present in the United States. The media is controlled not by a state censor, but by a handful of corporations that have essentially the same effect on information flow. The wealth is concentrated, with a specificity and a statistical reality that dwarfs anything Wadia has managed. The surveillance apparatus is extensive and largely unchecked. Political opposition is managed, not through imprisonment necessarily, but through systems of finance and media access that achieve comparable results. The military spending priorities speak for themselves. And the elections. The elections are managed by money in ways that make the distance between them and Aladeen's prearranged results a matter of mechanism rather than principle. This is the satirical grenade at the center of the film, and it detonates with remarkable force precisely because it arrives embedded in what has up to this point been a mainstream comedy with broad commercial ambitions. You are not expecting it, and because you are not expecting it, it lands clean, without the defensive posture you might adopt if you knew the argument was coming. The comedy has opened you up and the satire walks straight through the gap. What makes the speech work beyond its surface provocation is its internal structure. Aladeen is not simply making a rhetorical equivalence between Wadia and America. He is making an argument about the relationship between the form of governance and its substance. The argument is, the form can be democratic while the substance is authoritarian, and the substance, who actually controls the wealth, the information, the mechanisms of power, is what matters. The form is marketing, the substance is reality, and Western democracy in this reading has successfully maintained the form while progressively hollowing out the substance. And the people too busy arguing about the surface, about the elections, the speeches, the procedures, have not noticed the substance draining away. Is this a complete or entirely fair argument? No. The film is not presenting it as a philosophical treatise. It is satire. It is satire in exaggeration in service of a point. But the point underneath the exaggeration is real enough that sitting with it, really sitting with it rather than dismissing it as the provocation of a character who is supposed to be the butt of the joke, is genuinely uncomfortable. And discomfort that makes you think is the most honest thing satire can produce. After the speech, the constitutional signing is disrupted. Tamir's plan collapses. Ifawad is removed, and Aladeen is restored to power in Wadia, but restored in a different relationship to that power than he left with. Here is where the film's ending is its most honest and most complicated choice. Aladeen does not renounce power. He does not step down. He does not transform himself into a democratic reformer committed to the genuine flourishing of his people. He goes back to being the leader of Wadia with Zoe, who goes with him, and this has troubled people. This ending has been criticized as a betrayal of the satirical project, as a commercial concession that gives the audience the romantic resolution and the happy ending while abandoning the film's own implied argument about the nature of power. And I understand that criticism. On first watch, it can feel like the film flinching, stepping back from the consequences of its own logic at the last moment. But here is what I think is actually happening in that ending, and here is where the film's honesty, in a strange way, becomes most complete. The film is not saying that Aladdin has become good. It is not saying that Wadia has been saved. It is saying something much more unsettling, that systems of power are not dismantled by individual moral transformation. That even a person who has genuinely changed, who has cracked open, who has encountered something real in themselves and in others, can return to those systems and be reabsorbed by them. The institutions survive individual transformation. The machinery of autocracy does not shut down because the autocrat has had a revelatory experience in Brooklyn. It adjusts, it incorporates, it continues. Zoe going with Aladdin to Wadia is the film's most controversial image, but look at it carefully. She is not going as a subject. She is going as a partner, as someone who intends to continue pushing, continue challenging, continue introducing the crack in the worldview that has been opened. Whether that project would succeed in the environment of Wadia is left entirely and deliberately open. The film does not give you a bow on this, it gives you a possibility and a question, and that is honestly more interesting than a clean resolution would have been. The post-film scene, the brief coda that plays before the credits complete, returns to Aladdin in Wadia, and what it shows is deliberately ambiguous. There are signs of the change, small ones, quiet ones, easily reversible, the kind of change that could mean everything or nothing depending on what comes next. And the film does not tell you what comes next, because the film is honest enough to know that it does not know, that nobody knows, that this is the reality of how change works in the context of entrenched power, not through dramatic transformation but through small, fragile, uncertain shifts that may or may not survive contact with the systems they are embedded in. There is a hidden detail in the final scenes that most people miss on a first watch, and this is one of those moments where the film box earns its name. In the background of the final Wadia sequence, if you look carefully, there are subtle changes to the public iconography of the state. Not revolutionary changes, not the wholesale dismantling of the personality cult, but small adjustments, a detail here, a modification there that suggests the machinery is beginning, very slightly, to adjust. The Aladdin who returned is not exactly the Aladdin who left, and the state he returned to is not exactly the state he left. The changes are small, they may not hold, but they are there, and spotting them on a second watch changes how you experience the ending entirely. The foreshadowing in the film, when you return to look for it, is more carefully embedded than the first watch reveals. There is a sequence early in the film, in Wadia, before the conspiracy unfolds, where Aladdin is shown alone in a room briefly, without an audience, just for a moment. And in that moment, the performance drops. Not completely, but enough that you see something, a flicker of something unperformed, something private. The film lets it breathe for about 3 seconds and then snaps back to the public persona. On a first watch, most people miss it entirely. It reads as a momentary tonal shift. On a second watch, knowing everything the film is going to show you, it reads as the film's most honest image, the real person, glimpsed for 3 seconds before the machinery of power snaps back into place. The 3-second image is what the entire film is actually about. The personal reaction the ending left me with, and I want to be honest here, because this is where my rating comes from and where the film's complexity is most fully felt, is a mixture of genuine admiration and genuine frustration. The admiration is for the ambition, for the third act speech, for the specific character work that Baron Cohen does throughout, for the genuine satirical nerve of the Tamir subplot, for the willingness to resist a clean resolution. The frustration is for the gap between what the film achieves and what it was clearly capable of achieving. Every time it takes a broad comedic detour in the middle section when it could have pushed deeper. Every time it reaches for the easy laugh when the harder, truer observation was right there. The film is always gesturing toward a version of itself that is sharper, braver, and more fully realized, and it almost gets there, almost. That distance between what it is and what it could have been is where my rating lives. So here we are, at the bottom of the box. Every layer peeled back, every detail examined, every hidden thread followed to its end. And now comes the moment where everything gets weighed, not just what this film does, but what it is worth, what it adds up to, what it means to sit with it, having seen everything it chose to show and everything it chose to withhold. My rating for The Dictator is 4.8 out of 10, and I want to be careful here, because a rating that sits below 5 can read as dismissal, and dismissal is not what this film deserves. A 4.8 is not a verdict of failure. It is a verdict of profound incompleteness. It is the rating of a film that contains genuine brilliance in specific identifiable moments and then fails to sustain that brilliance across its full runtime. It is the rating of a film that knows exactly what it wants to say and then, repeatedly, chooses not to say it as clearly or as fully as it could. It is the rating of a film that earns real admiration and real frustration in almost equal measure and leaves you sitting with both feelings simultaneously, unable to fully resolve either. Let me be precise about what earns those points. The third act speech alone is worth significant credit. As a piece of satirical writing, as a constructed argument embedded in a comedic context with genuine political nerve, it is remarkable. In a film landscape where mainstream Hollywood comedy almost never touches the mechanics of democratic erosion with any real analytical courage, that speech stands out like a flare in the dark. You remember it. You think about it after the film ends. You find yourself, days later, turning its central argument over in your head and checking it against the world you actually live in. That is what good satire does. That is what this film in that specific moment achieves completely. Sacha Baron Cohen's performance earns its points too. The physical specificity of the character, the emotional moments that break through the broad comedic surface, the genuine vulnerability that flickers in the quieter scenes. These are the marks of a performer working at a level that goes beyond what the genre typically demands or rewards. He is doing real character work inside a broad comedy framework, and the gap between what he is doing and what people typically notice him doing is one of the more interesting critical blind spots in the film's reception history. Ben Kingsley earns points for bringing genuine dramatic weight to a role that could easily have been a throwaway. Anna Faris earns points for refusing to let Zoe become a punchline when the script occasionally pushes her in that direction. The score earns points for doing sophisticated tonal work that most audiences absorb without consciously registering. The visual contrast between Wadia and New York earns points for expressing in pure image what the script is working to say in words. And the ending, the complicated, unresolved, deliberately ambiguous ending, earns points specifically for its refusal to clean up the mess the film has made. The Dictator does not tell you that everything is going to be fine. It does not tell you that the crack in the worldview will hold. It does not guarantee that the small, fragile changes Aladeen has undergone will survive contact with the machinery of power he is returning to. It leaves you in the uncertainty. And that uncertainty is the most honest thing the film could have chosen in that final moment. It takes courage to resist the clean resolution when the commercial pressure toward it is enormous. This film resists it. That deserves acknowledgement. What costs those points? What holds the rating below 5 and keeps it there is the accumulated weight of the film's evasions. Every time the middle section drifts into scattershot comedy that has no connection to the film's satirical engine. Every time a broad, generalized shock laugh replaces the specific, character-rooted, analytically grounded observation that the film is capable of, and occasionally delivers. Every time the romantic arc between Aladeen and Zoe is shortchanged by pacing choices that prioritize comedic set pieces over emotional development. Every time the Tamir subplot, the most politically sophisticated strand in the entire film, is pushed to the Martians when it should be front and center, the film cost itself points through inconsistency, not through incompetence. There is no incompetence here. Everyone involved is working at a high level. The cost comes from inconsistency of nerve, from the moments where the film could have pushed harder, gone deeper, trusted its audience more fully, and chose instead to retreat to the safer, broader, more commercially legible version of the same moment. Those retreats are not fatal, but they accumulate. And by the time the film reaches its genuinely powerful conclusion, you are experiencing that conclusion in the context of everything the film chose not to be in the 40 minutes preceding it. And that context matters. It is why the speech lands but does not land as hard as it should. It is why the ending resonates but does not resonate as fully as it could. The compromises earlier in the film reduce the impact of the ambitions at the end. 4.8 is the rating of a film that is better than its reputation and less than its potential. That is the most honest summary I can give. Now, who should watch this film? This is a question worth answering carefully because the audience match matters enormously here. If you are someone who finds political satire genuinely engaging, who is interested in questions about the mechanics of power, the performance of authority, the gap between democratic form and democratic substance, you should watch this film. Not because it answers those questions with complete rigor or consistency, but because it asks them in a mainstream comedic context in ways that are sometimes genuinely surprising. The speech alone is worth your time. The Tamir subplot is worth your time. The ending is worth sitting with, and Sacha Baron Cohen's performance, understood as a piece of character work rather than simply a delivery mechanism for shock comedy, is worth serious attention. If you're someone who came of age with Borat, who holds that film as a standard setter for what subversive, boundary-dissolving comedy can be, you should watch this film, but you should adjust your expectations first. This is not Borat. It does not have that film's specific, unrepeatable energy. It is a different creative mode, scripted, structured, more conventional in its narrative architecture, and measuring it against Borat will produce frustration. Measured on its own terms as a scripted political comedy with genuine satirical ambitions, it is a considerably more worthwhile experience than that frustrated comparison tends to produce. If you are someone who enjoys character-driven comedy, who responds to the comedy of a specific person with a specific worldview colliding with a world that does not accommodate that worldview, this film will give you genuine pleasure in its best sequences. The fish out of water mechanics are well executed. The comedy of Aladeen's specific incompetence in ordinary social situations is frequently very funny in a way that has nothing to do with shock value and everything to do with precise comic construction. Those sequences work as pure comedy independent of any satirical ambition, and they are worth enjoying as such. If you are someone who is particularly sensitive to humor that engages with cultural and political stereotyping, and there is genuine reason to approach this film with that sensitivity, because it does engage with that territory in ways that are not always as precisely targeted as the film's best instincts would suggest, then this film will likely produce significant discomfort at points that are not offset by sufficient analytical payoff. There are sequences where the humor is operating in territory that raises legitimate questions about the relationship between the satirical intent and the actual impact of specific choices. Those sequences are real, they are not imaginary. And if that territory is one that affects your experience of comedy in ways that outweigh the film's genuine achievements, that is a completely reasonable and legitimate response. The film will not be the right watch for you at this particular point, and that is worth naming honestly. Who might simply not connect with this film, regardless of any sensitivity considerations? Someone looking for pure, consistently executed comedic entertainment without the tonal shifts and satirical detours. The Dictator is not a consistently funny film in the way that a well-constructed, conventional comedy is consistently funny. It has peaks and valleys. It has sequences that are trying to do something other than make you laugh, and those sequences will feel like interruptions if you came purely for the comedy. The unevenness is real. If a film that knows exactly when it is going to make you laugh and delivers on that expectation with clockwork consistency is what you are after, this is not that film. As for how to watch it, streaming is the right format for The Dictator. This is not a theatrical experience. It never was, even in 2012. The film's pleasures are the kind that benefit from the more intimate, engaged viewing context that home watching provides. You can pause. You can rewind the speech and listen to it twice. You can sit with the ending and let the ambiguity breathe, rather than being swept out of a cinema by the momentum of the crowd. The film rewards the kind of attention that streaming enables, close, unhurried, present. It is worth your time on a streaming platform. It is absolutely worth the cost of a rental if you have not seen it. It is not a film that demands physical ownership, unless you are the kind of collector who wants the specific artifact of a specific cultural moment, in which case the 2012 release is a genuinely interesting document of its time, and owning it in that context makes complete sense. One final thing before we close this box. One final powerful thing that I want to leave you with. Not about the plot, not about the rating, not about who should or should not watch it, but about what this film ultimately represents in the landscape of political comedy. The Dictator is a film that was made by people who had something real to say in a commercial format that made saying it fully and clearly very difficult. And the film they made is the record of that difficulty. Every brilliant moment in it is the sound of that genuine ambition breaking through. Every compromise moment is the sound of the commercial context pushing back, and the final film, uneven, inconsistent, frustrating, and genuinely remarkable in specific ways, is the result of that ongoing negotiation between what was wanted and what was allowed. Watching it with that understanding does not make the weaknesses disappear, but it makes them legible, and it makes the genuine achievements feel more significant rather than less, because you understand what they were achieved against. The most honest thing you can say about The Dictator is that it is a film that almost told the truth, almost in the fullest, most complete, most courageous way, and almost, when you can see how close it came, is not a comfortable place to live with. But it is a real place, and real films made by people with genuine intentions operating inside genuine constraints, often live there. That is the box. Every layer of it, every contradiction held inside it, every brilliant moment and every lost opportunity examined side by side, given equal weight and equal honesty, every film is a box, and we open this one together. Thank you. Genuinely, thank you for being here for this one. If you made it all the way through this breakdown, you are exactly the kind of film lover this channel exists for. The kind who wants to go beyond the surface, who wants to understand not just what a film does, but why it does it, what it is trying to be, and what the distance between its ambitions and its achievements tells us about cinema, about culture, and about ourselves. If this video gave you something, a new way of seeing the film, a detail you missed, an argument you want to push back on, please hit the like button. It takes 2 seconds and it means everything for a channel like this. Subscribe if you have not already, because every week we are opening another box and you do not want to miss what is coming next. And most importantly, drop a comment. Tell me where you land on this film. Tell me whether you think my 4.8 is too low, too high, or exactly right. Tell me whether the third act speech landed for you the way it landed for me. Tell me whether you think Zoe going to Wadia was the right ending or a betrayal of everything the film was building toward. That conversation is what this channel is made of. I read every comment. I respond to as many as I can. Your perspective matters here. The discussion question I want to leave you with is this: at what point does a satire become complicit in the thing it is satirizing? The Dictator walks that line throughout its runtime, sometimes successfully, sometimes less so. Where do you think it crosses it, and where do you think it stays on the right side? I genuinely want to know. Put it in the comments. Let us have that conversation. Next time on the Film Box, we are opening something that looks completely different on the surface, but carries some of the same deeper questions about identity, performance, and the cost of inhabiting a role so completely that you lose track of what was underneath it. I cannot tell you more than that yet, but trust me, you will want to be here for it. Every film is a box, and we've only just started opening them. That's the film box. See you in the next one.